the more regular things. But I wanted to talk a lot about VR, especially the future of VR. One, because it's kind of proof work, not as a question, but as a sort of sad, unfortunate statement that kind of there's no avoiding it in terms of the potential of VR. Like the printing press for digital assets. And like one of the things that has really bothered me about VR has been the potential psychological pitfalls from getting lost in something so as deep as reality is in terms of the size of the earth. Humans have managed to make what is in fact a vast wilderness feel very small and tiny with creation, popularization of cities, whole massive scaling of reality that we live in, right? And this whole dance to play with the game of will we, won't we make new roads to make reality more useful. So this has been the pathway of literally creating pathways, like even pathways of convenience, paths that will cut through fields because they don't feel like walking around sidewalk, and then going all the way down to mental pathways. So this is a continuous dance going from one scale to the other, right? And there's so much that comes in this at a moment by moment. What's the best option to make at any time? Feel with the advancement of something like technology to project new reality. The scale is already a non-issue. You can create virtual realities 4 orders of magnitude larger than the very real reality that we live in by creating functions that shrink the relative avatar to the 1/10 scale of the reality that they're in, and then using that as a way to explore. So this has been one of the big quasi solutions for the Fermi paradox that most civilizations will inevitably find it easier to invest in virtual reality far more than exploration. And especially when you look into the energy potential of creating, things like Dyson storm, converting large planet mass, like converting a gas giant into graphene, and then wrapping a star with that mesh to capture most of the sunlight. Like it's ridiculous on the outset, but very possible, and the sort of thing that works at civilizational scale, that the energy that you're then able to harvest from such a construction, keeps. It's like what happened with the aqueducts and the Roman roads. It's infrastructure for the future. Like the Roman roads lasted 1,000 years longer than the Roman civilization. Same with the aqueducts in some cases. So a lot of these places will have dead civilizations around them, and that'll be. I mean, is that the inevitable truth of it? Because humans on the outset are always 20 years away from eradication by some some environmental catastrophe. So this is part of what happens with demographic collapses. Just when large order events change the behaviors or the availabilities of, large swaths of the population, like 10-year, 5-year spans, sure, you can recover from a disaster like that if your lifespan is 20, 30 years. But then if you have, like, what makes humans so robust is that we have, one, a reproductive cycle that is open throughout the year. Two, just the thinking capacity to combinatorially explore, names and patterns that we can use to offset, one, our own thinking in any given time, while two, offer us pathways to, use that word again, just, access to resources that we wouldn't otherwise have had a chance to without, that language, that cultural element being in place to facilitate access to one thing or another, right? So if it only takes 20 years of a mistake to really screw things up in terms of potential recovery and, potential survival of the species, like, it would, the problem with humans is that we really truly have we have a large span of time that we can be productive members of society, but it's also the exact moment in time when we're also our most effective as reproductive members of society. So it's that general dance between the two that, makes societies worthwhile. Like, that span and window would have opened a lot earlier and lasted a lot longer in previous eras just because of, teen pregnancies and early, what is it called, child labor laws, things like that. So there's this sudden battle that I start to see in the tales and annals of history, while also in projections into the future of science fiction, where, like, morality becomes its own undoing. It's one of these really sad and frustrating things. And, like, how do I say? Like, the reason why, like, holy men get assassinated, like, it's, I think I may have mentioned this a few times, but maybe in Dostoevsky, probably Tolstoy, is talking about, like, not resisting evil, and that seems to be the trial that makes, it's the challenge of slaying the dragon, so to speak. You fight, but the interpretation of the dragon, is the dragon itself evil, or is it a force of nature? And then understanding that you're dealing with a force of nature creates a different response pattern in the individual than if you're responding to evil, right? And this is kind of where the metaverse comes into fray, right? In ideas like the fall of Atlantis, the collapse of alien civilizations around massive gas giants, these all have a common theme of, what are the people in the society resisting to create a future worth living in, right? A Dyson sphere civilization is resisting scarcity, whereas a civilization that's now working, like us, to acquire resources, but scarcity is not as much of an issue as much as allocations of resources. So, like, even with a Dyson civilization, a Dyson sphere civilization, being able to harvest that much energy, the question then remains, what can the people imagine to do with that energy? And that will change the scale of the effectiveness of that Dyson swarm. So there's a twofold pattern happening here with the future of work, everybody going virtual, everything going into VR. Carbon footprints drop because people are moving less. It's just, it's simple to a point. Like, there's still energy being spent on, generating the internet and things like that, but when you're not using a dedicated hydrocarbon fuel source in your gas car, airplanes, even heating homes, like that, if home heat is the last fixture of carbon, and even that's, interchangeable with, I'm not sure if, geothermal energy will be practical for most people, but out in the vast majority of the country, it is very viable. And then when you get into city layer concentrations where the energy density of, coal is very useful, you then have the option of, using the heat from nuclear power plants to heat cities, and then using the offshoot excess energy in the summers to do things like smelting. And, there are batteries that are liquid metal that can store at higher energy densities and need to stay in a heated state. So, there are configurations for Earth's energy capacity now that exist that are much more efficient, but it's the question of finances as energy allocation becomes, kind of the elephant in the room in terms of getting things to actually work out in any practical sort of way. Because even though you can harvest and allocate as much energy as, theoretically feasible, there's always, there's a use for excess and pushing the boundaries. So one recent story has been this idea of Jeff Bezos building a super yacht and needing a bridge taken down and put back up so that this super yacht can go from the manufacturing plant to, the open ocean, right? And the bridge is a drawbridge as well, or rather an elevated bridge that has a, little section that, or rather sizable section rather, that goes up and down and lets most boats through, but the sheer size of Bezos's boat requires that the bridge be taken down. And the last time this happened was like 1948 or something like that, under Nazi bombing. So it's these sorts of like continual scaled interpretations of how to use energy and resources for either the individual's benefit or the society's benefit. So this creates a series of conflicts of interest, like me before we, there's no I in team, all that jargon, right? And another thing that happens with this as well is, there's an incentive of somebody using a great deal of resources to prevent others from using resources effectively. So, just making, the price of oil drop because nobody else is using it makes the price of, private jet flights much lower, for instance. So even though, most people never had access to private jet money, all of a sudden those that do now have, an order of magnitude more, maybe a scalar multiple. So price drops by 50%, you have twice as much access to that. Whereas, if if the borders of access to travel now come on, sort of social credit score, vaccination systems, the barriers to entry to access large amounts of resources get diminished, systematically in this way. So, reality becomes smaller and smaller, whereas virtual reality expands exponentially. And with that, the minds get lost, and we have a whole new sort of fun cultural mode that we're following. And now the question is this right or wrong? Is this good or evil? Is this the best pathway for humanity in the long, short, medium term? Most likely a little bit yes and a lot of bit no. So where is the yes in creative capacity and, allocating resources in figuring out ways of being more efficient with less, 100%. How is it, not necessarily the greatest thing for us? I mean, we already have television addiction, we have gaming addiction, we have internet addiction, and VR addiction just seems another layer of all of these previous addictions that are now much more able to override reality, especially when you add on drugs and VR. So, opiates, stimulants, the whole shebang, but then there's now a whole range that becomes opened up because of, you have a VR system on your head. It doesn't take a lot of creativity to put together an EEG module and an injection system for either electronic stimulation to the brain or direct chemical triggers for whatever chemistry you want at any given time. So it's, I mean, and part of the concern here is as well, like, the productive capacity of humanity is always fed on feeding these cycles of addiction. I mean, food, sure, energy to keep life going, entertainment, sure, and it provides information while as well relieving stress and giving perspective and acculturation that makes it easier to form a cohesive unit as a society. So, media is not all bad, It's what makes society in a lot of ways. Like, but then what happens when that media has to then serve double duty in replacing human to human contact? Like, never in the history of humanity have we needed to talk to others less to get everything we need. Like, especially if you're able to, I mean, this is kind of where the work environment comes into play to make the level of reality succinct enough, like, that we want to engage with it, or that we have to engage with it to keep, the conditions of life going at a standard that we deem, desirable. But there's this secondary transition that happens where, it's partly called the rat race historically, or, the struggle to the top of whatever dominance hierarchy that's been set up in front of you to, one, set up esteem for yourself and the sort of cultural modes of quality, gain access to improved nutrition, mate, friends, life, fulfillment, yada yada. And once this is no longer mediated by contact with humans, but contact with software, especially software that you can purchase, or software that you can steal, or software that you can do effectively depraved things in order to gain access to, you shift society in a couple, like, inevitably worrisome ways. So, I mean, this is part of, like, the discussion that's been happening in my head for a couple of years, and then with my team over the last year. And, like, what strategies can we take to avoid this sort of destruction of humanity, so to speak? And really, what it's come down to for me has been making sure that virtual reality is never able to, I wouldn't say superimpose, but become superlative within reality. Like, the mystique of virtual reality is in that you can create whatever you want to experience life as you want it, right? But the influence of reality is that the exponential access that you gain in these virtual spaces are, drops in a bucket of the potentiality based on the dimensions higher than yourself. So this is now where we go back to aliens. So aliens created our reality, yada yada yada, but we are a VR simulation for them. Why do they not live here 100% of the time? Because there's much more possible to go around there in a higher dimensional space. Whereas in a lower dimensional space, which VR worlds inevitably kind of have to be, like we're in, I guess this is just the kind of a law of informational reduction. As the space that you're storing a hologram of something shrinks, like the virtual reality cannot take up the same space as the real reality that you live in. It's got to be based on representations of data. So like there's a computing language somewhere to create something as close to reality as possible. And what happens with something like a VR game, and particularly with something like this design, is you have to write fractal software to increase the depth of perception, or rather the influence of the individual pieces of data. It's a compression algorithm, right, or a compression system for reality. So that you could essentially describe the field forces as that. Different compressions for the different the different universal forces, and then you apply them in a given like pattern function, and then you get small object, galaxy, universe, and different configurations of electrons. And yeah, I mean, you can do it with just the representation of the electrons, honestly. But once you add the protons to them, the electron behavior can be allowed to do things like move through a wire while the protons are there, the solid structure. So fun things like this start to happen in virtual reality, where you can create reality as real as our reality and create fantasy, wonderful experiences that are wonderful. But you can also do things like create realities more real than what you're existing in now. And this is something that's been sort of discussed a little bit with people dealing with the DMT experiences, right? Where they claim to have fallen into a reality and it's hyper real. But the crux of the issue comes in how you choose to set the embeddings for a deeper reality. Like, if you're generating forces, sure, you create field equations, but if you're creating homes and cities, the level of abstraction you need is much, I wouldn't say lower, but more. I mean, I guess the minutia is the point. So you'd be labeling things as plastic in a reality aimed at producing a home life versus a reality that's aimed at producing something like a universe. Those labelings are not necessary, but you create the labelings in the exploration of that reality, and you have the beings or whatever system you have to explore that reality create the labelings. Whereas in a limited reality, you have the labelings preset. You bring in assumptions from the outside reality to inform the basics of the virtual reality that you've just created. So within this space, you also have the options of, we see them. I guess a good example of them would be the Snapchat filters, dog faces, anime faces, things like that. And even those are, dimensionally reduced representations of our current space that you can convey an emotion more saliently if you're not so distracted by your worry that somebody's looking at your acne or something like that. So this is where virtual reality starts to impact the quality of interaction between humans by reducing the informational complexity that we have to deal with. as we, see each other on camera, meeting each other in person. But then there's a loss of depth in terms of what it means to be human once we're stuck using, 80 to 90% of our interactions with humans that matter are based in virtual worlds. Because, if you're ordering all your food and you're working remotely and you have an in-house laundry system, do you ever really need to leave home? And what happens when that becomes the norm? If home is the office, if, even here, I've got a green screen, it's effective, ridiculous, 4 screens and maybe 5. My room has become my office. And I've had offices. I had an office prior to COVID. And, there's definitely it's been it's been the talk of the last year or so, the change in the quality of work that's happened because people have gone remote, right? Where work used to be a solid 8 hours, I'd commute, go in, do what I needed to do, and come back out, and there was a step-by-step process. Now work has become a 24-hour slog, where it's because the setting doesn't change, the work continues on. And once the office is the virtual world and the places of work and play become effectively one place, the joy that comes with that work is significantly diminished, I gotta say. And so this is where I want to create virtual realities that are designed to layer onto other virtual realities. So these are linear combinations of realities, so to speak. And it's a it's going to be a crazy difficult mathematical function to create, but it's the same idea of creating universes. It's the level of abstraction becomes so high that the application of the process over large swaths of space becomes trivial, because it generates space. So applying the same sort of interpretation to creating virtual worlds or creating virtual spaces for people to interact in, it's a worthwhile use of time, to say the least. But then the creation of those spaces to do things beyond just fantasy worlds in the game, but testing new clothing ideas, to test new societal ideas with different organizations of mental structures and things like that. So part and parcel of this journey is the increase in processing power that will come as demand for processing at this scale increases. So if you're that's the point of this work, really. I want to increase the demand for processing power by the individual consumer, so that the economics of having a quantum processor in your cell phone starts to make more sense for what that processor is doing. And this has been a issue that I've had to deal with for a while, because you can write software that will push it's much easier to write software that'll push hardware to its limits than it is to create the hardware that can handle software. So doing the same thing with the scale of virtual realities, I had to, as I designed the software to help create, even this is just a idle representation of what's possible with these sorts of pieces, right? What happens in the larger sense of creativity becomes once creative capacity is increased exponentially, but the amount of time in a day hasn't increased at all, you then have things like decision paralysis that limits what people choose to do, what you can do, and what ends up being done. And you have to eat, sleep, and drink water every day, so that time is lost. And then being able to choose what options are available to you versus what options are viable to the community as a whole becomes a whole different slog. Because part of the issue with virtual reality is that you can get so lost in creating and exploring and playing that you can create products without an audience yet, or without consumers. So, like, part and parcel of creating a system that uses these quantum processors, and feeding the research into use of these quantum processors, is as well fine tuning the economics of what people will be doing with them. And if you're creating virtual realities, it's one layer of the entertainment augmenting onto our reality, another layer of the entertainment. But then when you're doing things like biomedical research, protein folding explorations, or large scale explorations for classes of proteins that exist in blood or urine, or cerebrospinal fluid, things like that, like generally, like, there's this like sense of compilation. So in software, for instance, you write your code, you debug it, or it needs to compile. If it doesn't compile, then you need to debug it, right? With medical research, you send your samples in, you go through the centrifuge, the results need to come back from the lab, PCR cycles need to go get run through it. So there's always a lack of time efficiency in what we do, because humans, that's not what we evolved to do. We didn't evolve to schedule, we evolved to act and react. So in building these processors and building virtual realities, we can also improve the interfacing of ourselves with reality. And this is where augmented reality kind of comes to fruition. But augmented reality is really the end goal, where virtual reality is I wouldn't want to say a dead end, but its only real utility comes in augmenting reality, until we get to the point technologically where the quality of life and the quality of energy exchange between a virtual and real reality are non-issues. So, which would mean that you could do things like economically trade, but that doesn't seem to be something that we have with aliens yet, that with interdimensional aliens. So what's to say we can do that with virtual worlds? So this is where information economies kind of come into play, where in virtual reality you can explore and create designs for things that can be used in the real world. You can do things like beta testing. You can fight hundreds and thousands of battles in pitch combat, test stress points of combat armor, car parts, bicycles, anything like that. Feed that information and pass it on to a real world user that would then do the secondary testing. So virtual reality augmenting reality is the name of the game. And with that comes retexturing reality. I mean, like, very often we live in these blank white spaces, and even if you don't live in a blank white space, you want to be able to have the option of choosing your designs. And it may be that, or in all likelihood, it'll be that it's a lot easier to change the pixelation rate on a screen, but when your walls become your screens, there's a whole issue that comes with this. Especially if you can do things like create paints that act as layers of a structure. So this would be, literally you paint a room, you put a laser projector in the center of the room. The projector then sends laser beams around the room, laying the course of things like, circuitry that causes a reaction in the paint resin that, will form conductive pathways. Then you add a secondary layer of a different paint that may be the pixels. And again, you repeat this 7, 80, 90 times until you have a wall that is a screen. And, the painting process can be done automatically as well. So it's these layers of how people create the virtual realities and what becomes worthwhile. So, there'll definitely been the haves and have-nots in the virtual spaces. And then there's the, programmable matter layers of this as well, where, the same paint interpretation can also be applied to most matter. So, you can live in a virtual reality that is interfaced directly with augmented reality. So, your bed becomes a screen, your pillowcases, your bed sheets are projections or have projectable like interfaces because they're woven in with what do you call them? Fiber optic wires. And creating soft fiber optics is a whole field in of itself. But to keep this ramble kind of concise and useful, in order to generate a pathway of decision making for people after viewing something like this. The journey in creating virtual reality is the journey to improve reality, and not just as a financial system, not just as a, shallow profit seeking basic goal, but rather as a engineered transcendence of reality. And this is why like the drug conversation has to happen as well, with the questions of DMT and the ideas of the quality and realism of a lived reality. And with that exchange comes kind of a doom and gloom, because it inevitably means the death of a reality. And that is why, I shy away from certain levels of interactions with virtual worlds, like even like getting into Facebook, for instance. I kind of saw where it was going, so I waited this is what I generally do. I wait a year till the bugs are worked out socially, psychosocially. And so it's not, pioneering early adopter mentality, because, most pioneered products don't survive. How many Google products have failed, but their core product search survives? And the same thing with Facebook. Like, how many ancillary products that they're going to produce will fail inevitably, because their core product is the social network and creating that social networking environment for people, right? But there's creating a space for people to communicate, and there's actually letting people communicate. So this is one thing that I've noticed with, I guess I'd call it nanny culture. It's as old as civilization itself. It's a civilizing impulse to want to pacify people. This is like the issue with Socrates and Diogenes, like corrupting the youth or just being dogs in the street. If like having a view of objective reality may not necessarily be the most useful or the most effective because of paralysis. This is what I was talking about earlier with too many virtual realities, too much time, and too many options, but never sure what to do with what little time you have left, right? So part of what happens with having an interface system of quantum computers with human brains and virtual realities, and having an honest use of the three systems: humans, software, and hardware, you know, language being software in and of itself. Using those systems to create an optimization function for society as a whole. And this is where you get into the worrisome Skynet territories and total totalitarian regimes and things like that. But so there needs to be a way to include the democratic process into, crafting and creating a virtual worlds that are, accessible for us as a whole species, while also going back to maintaining the quality of life in base reality, at least as regards to us. So really that comes down into creating social networks to set and continually evaluate the optimization functions for societal running pots. Um, as much of a mouthful as that is, it will be much more of a headache to actually implement, because the problem with democracy is that the people need to be educated enough to actually have quality opinions and make sound decisions for the society as a whole. Like, if the people aren't able to make decisions that are good for themselves, and they're stuck in a cycle of poor decision making, the society collapses. It's just what happens. Like, it's the same will happen with regard to if the decisions being made for a large swath of the society by a small subset of society are not sustainable. So cities collapse, states collapse, civilizations collapse. It's the entire process of humanity. The rise and falls of cultures, and particularly as dynastic progression happens, the interest in preserving the dynasty becomes primary over preserving the society. Um, and I get, in some ways, it can be said that like Akhenaten was the last great pharaoh, but even that may have. That was a terrible joke. So the terrible joke in there is that Akhenaten kind of rewrote the entire culture of ancient Egypt to center around monotheism and worship of the sun. So, kind of the first Zoroastrian, the first Jew, the first Christian, the first Muslim, effectively. Well, I wouldn't say he's the first monotheist, but that same sort of sense, the centralization of cultural identity and force and energy. And with that cultural centralization of energy came a centralization of funds for funding temples. So donations to 5, 10 different gods would all of a sudden go to just one, making it very powerful within one generation. The same happened within the creation of Christianity, where the previous system had a wide temple system with priests of different sects, and they were all very powerful within their sub-dominions. But once the Roman emperor, who is a living god, says, hey, there's a god greater than me, and that's the one that I worship, and the cultural influence of the smaller cults that have less direct impact on reality start to, for lack of a better word, suck the soul out of previous gods. And this is kind of what I'm worried is an inevitability of the virtual reality space and the intersection of drugs, society, religion, culture, language, is what I'm calling the cult of the singularity, or the church of the singularity. Um, it's you're creating godlike systems and you're doing godlike work, and you're expecting people not to call it a god and to treat it as such, in terms of literally sacrificing their lives, sacrificing their bodies, and effectively sacrificing their children to a structure that demands them do so for the economic gain of very few. So, how then do you rewire such a system? How do you make sure that the God you create is benevolent? Um, and this is where the idea of superintelligence starts to come into play, because you can have a super intelligent, kind, and loving God. You can have a super intelligent, cruel, and manipulative God, but your kind and loving God may not let you know that they are kind and loving. Yeah. So a kind God that isn't kind enough to lie to you, in a way, is a kind of an ideal, in that at least you're not being led into being misinformed. But then there's the too much information aspect of having, like, there's this idea that you can anonymize data sets and cryptocurrencies or anonymous currencies and things like that, unless there's a particular point where the data is being scrambled beyond recognition. It's still interpretable with enough processing power. And then once you have what's effectively going to be, you know, like earlier on in this conversation, we spelled out a pathway to essentially harvesting all the energy from the sun by using something that could be called a quantum cascade. So this is where the interface of virtual reality, quantum computing, and our reality and languages gets very worrisome, in that if you're using quantum computers to create virtual worlds based on real world physics, and can then say, hey, I would like to start a chain reaction of one thing to another. How do I do this? You need two things: something of a catalyst, or the perfect conditions for that reaction to happen continuously. So what happens when you have your catalyst be produced by the reaction itself? So, for instance, you're churning water to wine, and in the process of turning water to wine, you also create a dust that creates grape seeds that that creates wine. So that's a terrible analogy. I'm going to try to think of a better one, but maybe oil to plastic, or no, I'm trying to think of something. I mean, the best example I can think of is life, which is where it gets concerning. So, um, yeah, this is where it gets really worrisome, because a quantum chain reaction would be, you start off with a hexagon of carbon, and you have a catalyst that takes in carbon dioxide, and with ambient heat attaches carbon in a hexagonal pattern to create this lattice that would be graphene. So once we get this going, like the cheap, efficient, large, supermassive sheets of graphene, the sky is literally the limit. I mean, not really. The sky can become a limit because you can wrap worlds in graphene. But I can say the concern really becomes the organization of energy at that scale of specificity. So, if you're printing and producing planetary scale works, planetary scale, energy sucks, reactions, chain reactions. So I should be honest, the main concern is chain reactions, because chain reactions have the potential to scale up beyond anything that you'd expected. So things going viral are a common chain reaction that we deal with every day in our day-to-day lives. But when you're dealing with a chemical chain reaction, you have what's called a gray goo problem, where everything around you becomes this gray goo. And now if we're interfacing virtual realities where we're experimenting and creating, the software to do this using physics, a general physics engine that is, instead of representing electrons as, points around a nucleus, a proton, you start representing them as they actually are, as a cloud, and then start doing things like sending signals to propagate around that electron cloud of, a graphene cycle, or a single, what do you call these things, neurotransmitter. You start literally rewriting reality as far as human perception is concerned, and as far as, chemical interactions are concerned, because it's a pattern being exuded by a transmitter. So, the look of it would be an antenna warping the fabric of space-time itself, but much more so warping the electromagnetic field to, let's say, suck out heat by reducing the motion, and, creating using an electrical difference to harvest heat energy to cause condensation, creating water. So, the barriers between technology and magic, shrink substantially. This is like the classic knowable unknowns and unknown unknowns coming out. But again, the worry starts to take shape with the idea of the future of work and access to higher and higher, more refined, more dangerous information, and how much of that, how much do you trust your people to do the right thing, and how much do you keep them ignorant of the reality to make life easier? And this will ultimately come down to how people raise their children, and whether or not, their children are educated in virtual reality or not. That is not a... So, I would like my children to have access to virtual reality, but I don't want them to live in it. It's, you need recesses, you need playtime, you need video game time, but you need interaction with base time, so that, you have fully functioning access to your muscles, your body, because a large part of creating reality, the concerns that come with the pairing of quantum processors with the human mind really come down to that DMT question of, is this actually reality, or is this a interpretation of, or a severely reduced data set to make some process more efficient that we're going through, and have our evolved forms come to the limit of what our mental forms are there to do. So, and then our mental form is there to do anything, or are we just here to eat, fuck, and die? Eat, fuck, reproduce, and die. And then that challenge of, setting boundaries, figuring out what is actually worth doing, and what is not worth it. And with regard to VR, the potential creativity afforded by VR cannot be missed, because it'll come down to, can you type? Can you create in Adobe Premiere? Can you, can you move around a 5-dimensional hypercube to get access to these data points that you need? So as you start dealing in non-Euclidean spaces, and non-Euclidean spaces become our interfaces to large swaths of information that are relevant to our lived realities. These interpretations of virtual spaces become, I mean, they were never not real, is the problem. That's one of the issues with the interpretation of them, but it's the impact that they'll have on lived experience that really needs to be taken into account. And I don't think most companies are ready to have that conversation yet, because in fact, I wouldn't even say that they're not ready to have it, is that the profit incentives are too high to have them, honestly. Like, it's been one of those chicken or the egg problems. Like, do you set the laws for VR spaces, or do you wait till the problem occurs and then set the laws? And this is kind of what's happening. I mean, China's taken a proactive stance to this, in that they've set up, bans on video game timing and all sorts of regulations on human choice. But again, the loss of freedom channels the energetic potential of the people towards an actual useful pathway. Hopefully. I mean, that's the assumption with creating these bans on, the behavior of children and adults. Like, there's an assumed understanding that those making those decisions know better for you. But if you can then wire the human mind directly into the quantum computer, have, I wouldn't say your wishes, like wishing on a quantum computer is very scary, because then that is literally, one, a level of reality warping that is concerning. I mean, especially with the religious connotations of wishing on a quantum computer, but then having such a quantum computer assess your current space, your current location in space time, and within itself, having been paired to your brain, find the pathways to guide you to your wishes, starts to create a very tangible God, like, well, God has answered your prayers so directly. Like, we've like we've never, like, as a species, we've never had this much information before. And as we started to see what happens when we have access to too much of it, we've started to find ways to limit our access to it, while also getting across what we want, while policing the wants of others. So this is where virtual reality starts to come into play. So whose virtual reality do you play in? Do you play in your own? Do you have the tools to create your own? Do you have the foundational education to create your own reality? Or are you stuck playing in the reality of somebody else's that you have to then make a million micropayments for? And can you make adjustments to the realities that others have created for you to make them more entertaining for you? So that's where, the tools that MSEINT would be creating come into play, because, it's all about giving freedom, but also giving freedom in a way that at least incentivizes creativity and exploration and informational fidelity. So, yeah, this has been a long conversation. We'll have a few more of them, but we'll talk later. Peace.